All right, I really want to try and do this as quickly as possible because it is a bit of a lecture. EQ, equalization. I want to use this picture because mixing is the process of kind of taking puzzle pieces and having them fit as best they can into the sonic landscape. And we use EQ to make sure that things fit. So besides panning, besides volume, we can kind of create the shape of our pieces using EQ. What is it? It is that process. So EQing is the process of using equalizers, equipment, to sculpt the sound by boosting or cutting the amplitude of frequencies. And we use that again to accentuate things that we want to hear in particular sounds, or to cut things that we don't want to hear, or to accentuate things that are there but aren't quite as audible as we want them to be. Two main parameters of EQ, again, amplitude, which is measured in decibels, and frequency, which is measured in hertz. Frequency is really about the number of vibrations created by a sound per second. Remember that audio is expressed in waves. So the lower the frequency, the fewer the vibrations of those waves per second, the higher, the more. Every sound source, whether it's a voice, bass, piano, covers a range of frequencies. In fact, a piano probably covers a very wide range of frequencies, while a bass is going to reside more on the low end. A hi-hat is going to reside more in the high end. So think of a fundamental or the sweet spot of particular instruments, and we use EQ to kind of carve out the elements that aren't as important so that the instruments that do reside primarily in those bands have space to be heard. So let the bass live in the low end and maybe carve out some low end from a guitar so that they don't have to share the overlapping frequencies. I think some visuals will help to see that better. Pitch and frequency go hand in hand in terms of kind of visualizing or think about it. The higher the pitch, the higher the frequency. The lower the pitch, the lower the frequency. I will do a quick demonstration of a snare drum. Here's a snare. If I raise everything above 6,000, it's going to get crispier. If I cut, it kind of gets boxier and less complete. If I raise the low end, which is everything above 200, it gets more thuddy, more soft, thinner by cutting it. Amplitude is really the loudness of what we're adding or cutting, how much. So again, by raising, I went up 12 decibels above at everything above basically 6,000. I can play with the Q, except with a shelf, it's kind of weird. We'll talk about the Q in a second. How is EQ represented graphically? You already saw this thing. It's an XY axis. The x-axis is frequency. The y-axis is amplitude, plus or minus. We can hear, at least most of us, from 20 hertz up to 20,000. As you age, you lose mostly from the high end. I've done some fun tests. I'm definitely losing my hearing, at least up above 18. The third parameter that's really important is the bandwidth. So again, we have frequency, we have amplitude, And bandwidth is essentially the range of frequencies that get affected. I'm going to focus in on this mid-range frequency here, or mid-range band. And I'm going to raise that up, and you can see all of these other frequencies that go along with it. If I come to the Q, or the bandwidth, I can narrow that, or I can widen it. So a more narrow Q is going to be a more precise move, while doing something like that is going to have a very broad and maybe not so useful effect. Let's listen to the snare drum again. I'm going to narrow the Q first of all. And I'm going to listen. You can hear, I hope you can hear it, a kind of a ring. If I raise this, okay, I think I got it, and I'm going to cut it. Let's say I don't want to hear that. So that doesn't affect as much the overall drum sound, but it helps get rid of that ring, which maybe it's conflicting with a note of an instrument, or we just don't like the sound of that. So again, we couldn't achieve that with a wide Q or bandwidth, but we can with a narrow one. There are different types of EQs. There are peak EQs, which boost fixed frequencies. I think I found some things that we have access to. This one here, where the low end is fixed, all you can do is kind of bring it up. But this is about fixed bandwidth. Here we can kind of, in the mids, this would be kind of a sweepable, but it is a peak in that we have no idea what the bandwidth is. We have gain plus or minus. We have a general sense of we're aiming at 1.2, but what else are we bringing along with it? A shelf. This high frequency is a shelf in that everything above 6,000 is going up. I can change that to a bell or parametric or bell. Filters cut or pass everything. Using this as an example again, we have two filters in this EQ. We have a high pass. I grew up calling these low cut, and depending on what EQ you use, it might be labeled differently. So you can affect the frequency. You can affect the steepness of the curve, the octave. So you can have a very sharp cut. So everything below 77, for the most part, is cut. But it's a roll off. But nothing will get through. Okay, same or inverse, I should say, on the high end. Parametric is kind of what we're focusing on. This is an it's actually not an interesting EQ, but it has 5 bands of parametric. The lows and the highs can be either peak or shelf, and parametric or shelf. The high frequency, we have the filters as well, and parametric meaning you have bandwidth, frequency, and gain. So again, when to EQ? Really, it's about when do we want to add or when do we want to cut frequencies. We add to accentuate the things we like. We cut to address the things that we don't. And we EQ just about everything. It is that process that helps us carve out the space that we need. There is a saying that some people love and some people hate, which is to low cut everything. I'm going to try and show you an image here. Let's look at the kick drum. And this EQ is kind of cool because it shows you the image. So if the kick drum lives down here, there's some frequencies here, but there are also some up here. Well, what else is going to live down here? The bass is going to live down there. There's elements of the guitar that are going to live down there. The snare drum has some low end frequencies, but if it's not core to the sound, why not cut it? Because the more tracks you have that have unneeded gain or volume or sound in frequencies that aren't important, those are going to add up, causing muddiness or a lack of clarity in your mix. So we're really carving space for each sound to come through. And I think that is where we're going to end the boring part.